All right, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Jazz, or Bright Smiling Sage of the Nanacook Nation, and I'm a design thinking, global health consulting, and social enterprise founding hybrid professional hailing from Atlanta, Georgia. I'd firstly like to acknowledge the traditional and ancestral territory of the Muskogee and Cherokee tribes of Georgia, on which I'm learning, working, and organizing today. And I'm thrilled to be here to be in community with you all for the second annual Festival of Urgent Reinventions. Hopefully, you all have had a really invigorating and inspiring past 2 days, learning from and being inspired by all the amazing speakers and artists that you've been hearing from. We have a really exciting session today about the power of storytelling and how it can inspire collective action and impact in both your individual, organizational, and societal levels. I'm thrilled to be joined by the incredible Raja Shah and Judy O on this panel. So I'll go ahead and kick it off with Raja to give us a brief introduction.
Thanks so much, Jazz, and happy birthday. I'm so happy to be joining you from the ancestral lands of the Nape people. I'm currently residing outside of Philadelphia. I teach at Drexel University. I'm the program director of product design there, where I run an undergraduate program in industrial design, as well as collaborate on many interdisciplinary design-related projects related to equity and ethics and design features. I'm also an avid designer and a futurist, and I consider myself to be a doomsday optimist. When I'm not teaching or working on projects at Drexel, I co-chair the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council for Industrial Designer Society of America. And you can hear my puppy because my kids are coming home from school. I'm so sorry that, of course, the minute I unmuted, he decided to greet my child walking up to the door. But it's so great to be here today to talk about stories. I really love them. They've really influenced my life, and they continue to inspire the way that I move forward as a designer in the world.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Raja. And yeah, it's so incredible to be in the space with Raja. She's a big part of my story and my design education. So it's always great to share space with you. And so Judy, would love to pass it over to you so you can introduce yourself and how storytelling is a part of your life.
Yeah, well, really excited to be here with you, Jazz and Raja. Nice to meet you. I also hail from Atlanta, Georgia, so giving respect to the Muskogee land that Jasmine had referenced. I'm really excited about this topic because it's near and dear to what I do and what I believe in. I'm a senior strategy director at a global creative consultancy called BCG Bright House. And we specialize in helping organizations excavate, articulate, activate their purpose. And a part of that work is helping them go back to their roots and understand, what are their ethos, what is their founding story, and how to really bring it to life in a way that's modernized and authentic to who they want to be as well. So super excited about tackling and talking about some examples of organizational storytelling and how that can be such a powerful impetus for making a positive impact in the world.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Judy. And yeah, really, really glad to have Judy here as well. I've had the opportunity to work with her in a community building organization called Global Shapers. We work in community with other young folks in the Atlanta area to drive social change in our community. So it's always been inspiring to see the work that Judy does personally and professionally. And so it's great to have her today as well. And so, yeah, just to dive into some of the impacts of how storytelling has propelled our diverse careers in the creative space. I know for myself personally, there's storytelling in terms of my personal self that helped me get into college. There's storytelling in terms of my vision for the future, which has really led into an entrepreneurial lifestyle that I live, specifically rooted in the sanitation economy, which is a very, very niche field, being able to talk about the future of sanitation, which is not something everyone wants to talk about. So I guess let's start with Raja. In your line of work, what's the best story that you've ever told or been a part of crafting, and why?
I feel like this is a really hard question to answer because my favorites tend to wander like day to day, minute to minute. So I will say that I'm very influenced by the power of storytelling. So people telling me stories, it changes the way that I move through life every day. In conversations. And I also think that design is an act of storytelling. But one of my favorite stories that is not my story. It's a story of Nichelle Nichols. If you all don't know who that is, this is Lieutenant Uhura of the Star Trek Enterprise 60s original series. And it's a story that she sort of told about the time that she quit her job. That is fairly popular and fairly influential, but I do think it has parallels to some stories that we tell ourselves these days. And for me, as a kid growing up, one of the stories that I like to talk about is the way that I connected with my parents through the power of like sci-fi and media, and how that's really influenced my career. But I think learning the story far further into my career has been more impactful the more I reflect on it. And so my mom is a Trekkie. And so I grew up watching Star Trek, and in syndication, I got to watch the original series and fell in love with that and fell in love with the characters there. And it always held an importance in my life, just in the way that I related to my family. But a couple of years ago, I actually had a chance to find a video of Nichelle Nichols recounting this time that she quit her job after the first season of Star Trek, the original series, sort of wrapped up. And her dream in life had been to become a stage actress, right? She wanted to be in musicals on Broadway. And so she had been on Star Trek, had a great season, and got the dream job offer and went to put it in her 2-week notice. And Gene Roddenberry, who's the creator of the series, like freaked out and was like, "You can't leave. Like, why are you leaving? Like, you don't understand your importance on the show." And very flattered, she left, and she says, "Well, I have to run. I have to get to a fundraising dinner for the NAACP." So she goes to this fundraising dinner in LA, and someone who's organizing the dinner came up to her and was like, "Someone here wants to meet you. They say that they're your biggest fan." And she goes, "That's great, but I'll have to talk to them later, because Dr. King is behind you and I really want to talk to him instead." And so Dr. King walks up and he goes, "I am your biggest fan." He was the person who had been waiting in the wings to talk to her, and went on to, recall how his family loves watching Star Trek every week. It's the only show that he lets his kids stay up late and watch. And she was like, "Thank you so much. I just quit. So I'm hoping that you'll still enjoy the show even after I'm not on there." But that moment became this conversation of him really convincing her to stay and talking about the significance of her role as being a Black woman on screen who wasn't playing the role of a servant or a maid, and was really holding her own as an equal on this crew, like on this command crew of the Star Trek, of the Starship Enterprise in Star Trek. But not just because she was an actress and playing a part in a sci-fi show. It was this representation of everything at that moment, this was happening at the height of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, which parallels a lot to what we're doing today, but also the power of representation in media. And it wasn't even the power of representation in terms of I could have a job on TV acting. It was Black people are in the future. This was a story that was told about what humanity becomes, centuries from now. And when we think about who shows up there, and we think about the diversity that was present on the crew of the Enterprise, we see, Sulu, we have Uhura, we have Spock, who's an alien or half alien, right? We have like all these different sort of like species and living together and working together on really diplomatic missions. And so there was this, not only the power of representation in her position, it was also this hope. She gave really Black people in America so much hope in her just being there and cast in the way that she was, which was not in this subservient manner. And so that power of representation really convinced her to stay, and she went back to Roddenberry and ended up staying on the show, and the rest is history, as they say, but not really, because that moment, she decided if she was going to stay and be on the show, and if it was that important, then she had to do more. And she realized that there was so much power in her position in representing so much to so many people, that she ended up working very closely with what became NASA, the Space Administration, and doing outreach programs. And she is like, I'm not going to say single-handedly, but her fictional character, Uhura, became a real world influence on women and people of color entering STEM and STEAM fields and technology, and especially the space race. And almost every single astronaut of the 70s and 80s who identified that way went through some program that she was a part of, that she was advertising for. And for me, it's not just like this thing that she committed to. It's like she just retired last year from doing this, like, and for health reasons, yes, but I think she would have probably kept doing it. It's influenced generations of people to come, right? And it's really opened doors in ways that we don't always think of. And I think there's so much power in storytelling, and the storytelling around fictions about possible futures that really inspire real realities now. And so that's one of the things that I like to really incorporate in the way that I work and the way that I teach, is using speculative stories, science fiction, to talk about things that we really want to see in the future, but also how do we avoid things that we don't want to see, and how do we think about the role and the influence of what technology might become, but also the people and the circumstances around it. And there's so many great stories also tied up in other things that I would love to talk about. But that story to me is one of the things that reminds me that even in me as a person, not understanding like my power in the world, I'm representing something for someone that I'm encountering, right? And it has a larger influence. And it's really important for me to sort of commit my practice in design as an educator into understanding that there's a power there and being represented and being present. And then I can move with intention throughout the world and sort of shaping things. And so it's not just me doing my job as a designer, it's really me thinking about using this moment where we are trying to diversify my field of design through the lens of stories. And so I love it. I try to teach and have all these pop culture references, but it's really, I just think it's like this remarkable tale that she tells that's just like so important, and everything about that encounter. Like, I just can't imagine, I get chills whenever I think about it, how easily it could have gone a different way if she had not gone to that dinner, if she hadn't had that conversation, and had she not been able to act in those stories on screen, as well as be able to recount the story of why she stayed, and why she was so committed to science, even though she really wanted to sing musicals on Broadway. So that's the story that I feel like we could all sort of kind of take away and think about in our own practice across the board.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Raja. I think it's such a testament to just how stories can look. Like, I feel like sometimes people think, especially now, that storytelling is a very specific, it comes in a specific form, it looks like a specific thing, it's a specific skill set or a vision that you might have, but it's also recognizing that kind of, blooming where you're planted and the influence that you have and the story that you're a part of in that moment and how that ripples into other people's lives. And I think, even transcending in you, Raja, and like, you were my first and only Black professor at Georgia Tech, and like how that's influenced my practice as a designer. And so I think it's just really cool to see, storytelling as a personal practice, but then also the stories that we are embedded in the life we live, and how we can show up in those ways to influence how the world continues to evolve. So thank you for sharing that with us. And I now want to talk to Judy sort of about how, looking at stories from a personal perspective, from your own, personal narrative, also transcends into organizational narratives. Like, what does it mean for an organization to stand and have a story about their purpose in society, especially now, kind of in light of everything and all these competing narratives in the world? So we'd love to hear a little bit about your work and sort of how you see storytelling playing a role in this.
Yeah. Well, just going back to Raja's story for a minute, I just wanted to share that you sharing that story had influence on me right now. And so I appreciate you sharing that story and bringing others along the journey. I think that's quite beautiful and impactful. So I guess to talk a little bit more about the narrative and the storytelling on the organizational side, I mean, it's not too different from a personal lens, right? Our stories are authentic in that it's part of our experience and it's part of our upbringing and the people that we surround ourselves with. So companies, exactly the same, where we really challenge them to put up a mirror to themselves and think about who they are at their best. And a lot of our process of excavating their purpose really encourages them to go all the way back to their founding story. We call it the story of origin. And we believe that the fruits are really in the roots, to really think about, why was this company founded in the first place? What was the impetus? What was the tenor of that time, right? What problem were you trying to solve? And what was the inspiration? And I'll tell you this one story that I absolutely love telling is the story of the North Face, the clothing brand, outdoors brand. And as many of you know, they've been around for a really long time, but along the way, they lost some of their mojo, right? As they got bigger as a company, they also became part of a larger company, F.O.U.R. And somewhere along the line, they sort of felt like we need to get our mojo back. And that really started a process of excavating what is our purpose? Why do we exist? What do we stand for? And so when we look back at their history, it was really cool to find out that they started as a small mountaineering shop in San Francisco back in 1966. And on their first day of the store opening, actually, the Grateful Dead was playing and Hell's Angels were at the door, right? Like that's a perfect picture of what the 1960s was like, right? They had this thing about themselves that was so daring and bold. Like one example is like back in I think 1970s, when there was a lot of environmental movements that was happening, they came up with something called the Ice 9 Awards, which is basically a way to spark conversations about, environmental awareness by calling out those people who were contributing most to ecological destruction in the world. So it was a sort of very tongue-in-cheek, but calling out those players who have this, a way of making impact in the world and giving them an award as a way to hold them accountable for their actions, right? So super bold, super daring, and so part of that 60s movement that was part of their DNA. And they lost a little bit of that as they got larger and more corporate. And so being able to look back at their history, they were able to channel some of that back into who they are and who they want to be in the future. So their purpose is around exploration, and they stood for exploration for a really, really long time. But through this process, they understood better the role of exploration in moving the world forward, right? Like how does exploring help us, not just as a physical expedition, but as an everyday mindset, help us open up to others and care about the environment around us and protect it so that we can actually make a world a better place. So that's one story I love to share because I love the brand. I love what they stand for. And even a brand like that had a little bit of reflection to do about who they are and how they put their story out into the world. And most importantly, that it drove actions. And how they make decisions about their people, about their products, about how their brand comes to life externally. So I think that's the one that I like to share.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much for that. I think it's so great to look at purpose and look at storytelling at that level, because again, I think it is oftentimes seen as one, single thing, what a story is and, how its value in society. And I think, not to like anthropomorphize, organizations or companies, but like they have a purpose, and like understanding their purpose and, having the people a part of those organizations rooted in that purpose. But then also for people who are making companies or who are choosing to join companies, how do their values and how does the purpose that they have in themselves match with the company? I think it's just such an important piece of what it means to move in the impact space. And so, yeah, I think really cool to hear that story about North Face. Had not heard of that, and really, really great to learn more about that. And I think now too, it's really a great time to sort of transition into thinking about some of the tools and kind of frameworks that help us in our practice, frame up storytelling, excavate, like you were saying, Judy, really understand the roots of where we're coming from and the visions of where we're going. And so, yeah, going back to you, Judy, just like in terms of the, doing purpose-driven, work with organizations, like, is there any tools or tips that you would recommend for people to use, or that are best practices, or that you lean on a lot that others can be inspired by?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I love how practical it can be in terms of how you apply this. I mean, there are tons and tons of tools out there. And I'm not officially a writer myself, but I think what I find to be really resonant and powerful are really three key tips. One is, I think it's really important to think about the question why, right? Why does this story matter? Why should anyone care, right? And I do that through the exercise of 5 whys until I get to a fundamental human truth where you can really answer something that could resonate with a large population, right? So if I'm talking about a story of a company on its way to change into something better, like, why does this story matter? Like, at the end of the day, what change is this going to really spark, and what is the end? To what end? And why should anyone care about this story? So I find myself always asking that question, why, until I get to that final sort of crystal clear reason. The second thing is tension. I think there's so much beauty in tension. And a lot of people find discomfort in tension, but I believe true creativity and true so anything worth fighting for comes in attention, right? When there's struggle, you think about why is this struggle worth going through? What's the conflict? How do we resolve it? And how do we hold two things in tandem that feel, odd at each other, right? So that idea of tension, how it comes through, is a critical part about what makes a story really tick. And then the last thing I would say is just simplicity. Something I challenge myself all the time. I think back at the Mark Twain quote. It's something he said, if I had time, I would have written you a shorter letter, right? Like it takes so much craftsmanship and eloquence and expertise to be able to see something so simple yet so brilliant. So even if it's your cover letter, an email, I don't know, an Instagram caption, like I think the simpler you can be, the more impact that you can drive in that story. So those are the three kind of tips that I have that I try to practice in my day-to-day.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much. I think, like the last point especially is so poignant. I feel like, just recognizing, again, there's so much information, there's so much noise in the world that we're in right now. And the people that shine through are the ones that have those crisp sound bites and moments that like resonate and they like hit us at our core because it comes from all this work and this intentionality of crafting that message. So thank you for raising that. And yeah, Raja, would love to hear any tools or best practices from your work as well.
Well, I think there's definitely tools, and it depends on obviously the media that you're trying to craft. But there's ways to think about best practices and tools sort of hand in hand. But one of the best practices that I try to practice or think about as when I'm working with my students comes from a quote from Octavia Butler, who's one of my favorite storytellers. And Octavia Butler is one of the OG science fiction writers. Happens to be a Black woman and has just left a legacy of amazing tales that I think, they're still seeing them sort of come to fruition. It's almost in a prophetic way. But she says that you have to write yourself in. And I think that that's really important in terms of thinking about the diversity and inclusion of how we connect with stories, is we see ourselves in them. And stories that we connect with are stories where we're not just being entertained by them, is that we can see ourselves moving through them. And a lot of that has to do with really careful world building and character development. So I would say when I think about like those best practices in stories, it's like thinking intentionally about who shows up in the stories, who's in it and who's left out. And then where are those power dynamics between people and what is that world in which they live in? And so some of the tools that I found have been really helpful is thinking about developing the stories, or even I design in the context of stories. So I do think that design is a context-driven activity that takes a lot of influences from people, politics, economics, time, place, materials, history. It's not something that can exist within a vacuum. And it's in response to those things, and it's only successful in evaluating the context of those things. And the best way to sort of capture that, and people use lots of different tools, is to really paint very poignant and illustrative stories and scenarios around those, right? Present, future, past, over time. So thinking about the design and context over time. And that to me really is the root of that is really world building. And world building is something that you see a lot happening in role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons, where you have to sort of craft, like Judy was mentioning, like key tensions that exist within this world and where they show up and at what levels they are, right? So you can't just imagine a scenario in which someone is using something. It has to be imagining something is using something in response to something else, right? So if someone's using something in response to extreme weather circumstances, for instance, right? Now you start to paint a picture of what you mean by weather, what you mean by extremes, and how those things need to perform in that context. And if it's extreme weather in the context of a tension of economic devastation, then suddenly you realize that you are dealing with two different tensions, one that's high need, one is low resource, right? And so when we think about how those tensions play out, and we think about all the context and history and the social impact and the environmental impact of all those scenarios that exist along that thread, along those tensions, then the design becomes a much more different scenario than just saying, I'm designing a thing, right? So, and it exists in the context of those tensions, and they could be social and political, they could be economic, they can be educational, they can be health related, right? But I do think it's really important to not only know what the tensions are, to define them and figure out where you are along the spectrum of all of those different things. And so there's templates that you can sort of see out in the world. I've been sort of adapting one that really looks at a futures framework and examining those tensions in relationship to other themes and scenarios, to sort of pull together a recipe for thinking about objects and design in the context of tensions and objects and influences in history. But I do think that there's a lot of tools out there that allow you to sort of play around with the algorithm of the world in which you're designing for. That way you can think about how you might reconsider your design given the adjustment of those various tensions. And so for me, I think that there's a lot to pull from role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons in that way, which really becomes almost like a formulaic way of sort of planning out and sort of plotting out these scenarios so that it's not just something that you are imagining and just hoping that it happens. It's something that you are using these tools to set up the parameters of a story and then allow the story to play out. So it becomes sort of a choose your own adventure as opposed to like an end that you're just trying to get to. And the other one that I would say is to really think about reading and watching really great stories. I think another tool that I think is really important is to understand what makes a good story and what makes people connect. And I do think it's as important to tell stories as it is to understand how to read them. And I think that if any English teacher from high school would say, being able to extract and analyze, understand the themes and the takeaways from reading a passage over and over again and looking at those same passages in different contexts and over time and from the point of view of different people and get something new out of it each and every time is a skill that we are always and actively developing. So I think that that's a really important thing that we need to remember is we should always be ingesting and listening to stories as much as we are trying to crack and tell a narrative or build a narrative around our ideas or goals or objectives or companies. It's really important to sort of understand what makes a good one. And I do find that in many ways, great stories tell a lesson. There's some parable, there's some takeaway that you're not only connecting with it if you see yourself in it in some way, but it also changes how you're seeing other stories in other places in the world, be they fictional stories or real stories. So this would be my best practices is just really like listen, write yourself in, and then look for some of those tools and frameworks which allow you to play with the complexity that really makes up comprehensive and well done stories.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you so much. I think really great stuff here and really tangible things that I think our audience will really appreciate as they move through their idea generation for the competition. And I think too, just to the point about having sort of a specific kind of, parable learning call to action. That's definitely been a learning over my storytelling journey as well as, specifically from my lens, talking about sanitation, talking about improved toilet design is not necessarily a reality that everyone, might be familiar with. So how do you invite people into that conversation? How do you invite people into the innovation? How do you invite people into the change that you're looking to make? And I think, the power of just thinking, through, if you're pitching an idea, if you're writing a story, it might not be the content of the story that everyone can exactly plug into, but you can invite them in by calling them to action or using a parable or using a lesson as a tool or framework to make it so it's beyond the toilet is what I often say. And so as we sort of frame up into the last bit of our conversation today, I think it would be really great to just hear from both of you about how participants in the competition could use storytelling. I know that we've talked about some tools, but how might they use storytelling in their deliverables here, and why is it important? So I know again we've talked about this on a high level, but if there's any specific examples based off of the brief, we can dive into that now. But yeah, either of you want to kick us off with that?
Well, I would say that there's some tried and true tools that I do think are really great. There's one that I think is used sort of ubiquitously across industries. And I do think the power of like journey mapping or experience mapping is a really great way to unpack a story that you have heard or scenario that you've gone through, or to collect information about something that you've seen in terms of an experience. And journey mapping, and people call it customer experience mapping, it's this idea of over a chronology, you're sort of looking at what are those significant phases that get someone from the beginning to the end of an experience, whether it's cyclical or it be like a linear, and then looking to find out and understand what people are thinking and feeling and doing, and opportunities along that journey. And usually if you can paint this scenario and talk about high and low moments, you're really talking about opportunities that might exist for you to intervene to improve the outcome of that scenario, right? But it really is telling a story with these milestones and points of like analysis. So it's kind of like having the narrator in a movie sort of like interject it in different moments to have you pay attention. So this is your opportunity to sort of look at areas and places to pay attention. And it's a graphical tool that usually is available on everything from Miro to Mural, and you can just do it with Post-it notes, but you're really trying to figure out where are these important moments, where are important moments in experience that we don't want to mess with, and where are important moments that we feel like we can't intervene. And what it helps you do is it sort of justifies, substantiates why you are bothering and messing with this thing in the first place. So you can say, these are the things that are working well, these are the things that are not working well. These are opportunities to intervene, this is where we want to focus. And so it gives you a way to paint a story and talk about areas that you want to focus. I think it's great as an analytical tool, but also I think it's great as a propositional tool. What is the story that you want to tell? What is the experience that you want to have? And what are those key moments along the experience that you need to be preserved, improved upon, or maintained around your intervention, that now your intervention is improving the outcome of the scenario, improving the experience overall, is making this thing easier to use, more equitable, more diverse, whatever it is. And how does that fit into it? And as a compare and contrast tool, I think that's super powerful. And it parallels a lot with storyboarding too, which is a more truncated way of doing it. So I do think the power of like drafting and creating these scenarios, be they real, speculative, or analytical, I think is a really great one to sort of like fall back on if you don't have any other sort of tools in your belt and you're not a writer.
Yeah, I guess to add to that, I think that was such a great advice that Raja gave. Maybe I'd take a slightly different route, just to have both at your disposal. Not only storytelling is it a life skill, I think it's a biological imperative, because I read in a book, I think it's called Wire for Story. Lisa Crone, the author, talks about how humans can go 40 days without food, 3 days without water, but only 30 seconds without searching for meaning. And so when you know that to be the human truth, right? The fact that we are born with a prefrontal cortex that's pretty much empty, and we spent our entire life filling it with meaning and stories, that says something about the people you're working with, the people you're working for, the people who you're designing for, right? Everyone's looking for that meaning. Why does this matter to me? And I think storytelling is by far the most powerful and effective vehicle to be able to translate that meaning to others. So if you think about it as a way to connect with others, a way to fulfill our biological need for meaning, and to use that as a way to build community, right? And to design something that's better for society, I think it becomes that imperative that's going to drive you in every aspect of your work and life, whether it's even just as simple as slide building. People think a presentation, is just like a tactical thing, but that's an opportunity to tell a story, right? How are you taking your audience on a journey with delights along the way and surprises, right? That can really capture not their just attention or just to entertain them, but to use it as an opportunity to call them to do something, be your advocate, be your, co-creator. And so I would really put storytelling as, such an important skill set that we must have as humans, but also that's something going to make a true differentiator in our work from just good to great.
And I want to also add something else to that too, Judy, that you reminded me. And I think the other thing is that thinking about like these tools and how we're framing stories and the important role and where we look for meaning is oftentimes when we talk about narratives, we think about this sort of like oral or written or media-based sort of like a retelling or recounting of something that's happened or we want to happen. I also, as a designer, I quote this a lot to my pictures. A picture is worth 1,000 words, right? So there's so much power in the image that we should also consider as ways that we are framing our stories. And those images could be images of the solutions or propositions that we're making, but they also can be contextual. They can also be inspirational, right? But then another quote that I like to say is like, a picture is worth 1,000 words, but like your prototype or your model or the thing is worth 1,000 pictures. So like you can tell so much from the higher fidelity of the outcome or output or your proposal. So there's so many ways to be more efficient about the way that we tell stories. And kind of going back to the the Mark Twain quote, I'd write you a shorter letter if I had more time. You can have more time if you really do try to think about how do I compact and in sort of fold all of these ideas into a single image. And what's a powerful image that someone can glance at and take away and like reflect back on and be able to extract those stories on their own without me having to say anything about it. And I really do think if the story that you're telling is sort of supplemental to that, it can be a really powerful tool, especially in the digital format.
Yes, I think that all of this is so incredible and so inspiring and really relevant to our audience here today. And I think just as an ending note, we've talked about a lot of different tools, a lot of different reasons why storytelling is a life skill, as Judy said, a biological imperative. But then also recognizing, as you're stepping into your truth as a person in this world, being able to communicate your positionality, your beliefs, who you are as a person, understanding the beats to that story. What are those moments that have to be captured to make the story real? But then also, if you're communicating to other audiences, keeping that storytelling, the medium, the cadence, how it's packaged, relevant to that audience. It's human-centered, recognizing that not everyone is going to, take everything in the same way. That's something that we have to be very intentional about in the sanitation space, and who is, more familiar with sanitation realities than others. And I think that that's just something that everyone should think about in their practice as well. So in short, life is about stories. It's the stories that we tell ourselves. It's the stories that we're told. It's the stories that we buy into. And so that's why it is, as we've talked about, such an important thing to package into the ideas that we're thinking about in the future, the past that we've lived through, the past that generations before us have lived through, and how, again, as we're working together to make this world more equitable, more inclusive, more sustainable, how might we use storytelling as a tool, a narrative, as a force for good? So thank you all so much for joining us today. It's been such an honor. Raja and Judy, really grateful for your time and expertise. And we'll give you all a couple seconds if you want to say any last closing words.
Well, I just wanted to thank you for having us on your birthday, and happy 30th birthday. And I would say that I love listening to Jasmine's story. So if those of you who have not had a chance to look her up, she has a number of stories out on the internet. I think one of your TED Talks. And I just think it's one of those ways that I love to connect with humans across the globe. And you are a beautiful storyteller. So thank you so much for being able to publicly share all of your love of WASH and design and human-centeredness on a regular basis. So it's really been fun to catch up with you that way.
Yeah, same. Happy birthday, Jasmine. Thank you so much for having both of us here. I'm walking away having learned more than I think I've contributed. So really appreciate everything that you've shared, Raja, as well as you, Jazz, and such a wonderful forum and such a passionate topic. I bet we could talk about this for hours. So it's nice to be in the same virtual room with kindred spirits.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. And I hope everyone else has a great rest of their Fridays.